Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. If you could do me a quick favor, see that little subscribe button at the bottom of your screen? Go ahead, click that subscribe button. Really does help our channel grow, our audience grow, and I really do appreciate it more than you know. So click that subscribe button. Appreciate your support. Now, here's the video that you came here for. But you see that guy on that screen right there? That's my man, Hugh Freeze. And if you've listened to this show for a long time, you know Hugh Freeze, friend of the show, but listen, I don't think I give him any sort of preferential treatment or whatever. I think he's a good football coach. I think he's the right man for Auburn. But I bring it up because this past weekend was the final recruiting weekend of the summer in college football. We talked a little bit about it on Monday's show. David Sanders, the five-star offensive tackle, was at Nebraska. All of these schools were having big events to try to get their commitments and their recruits on campus. Well, Auburn hosted their own event called Big Cat Weekend. One, it's kind of like the OG of summer recruiting events. Like, this thing's been going on since the Gene Chizik days. But then two, my man Hugh Freeze went to work on Saturday and Sunday because I'll tell you what, poor Hayes Fawcett, man, was working overtime. I think he put Hayes Fawcett in a casket. That poor kid was working so hard because Auburn just absolutely crushed over the weekend. And it's worth noting, coming off that 2024 recruiting class, which was top 10 in the country, really top 5, we're going to explain in a minute. They now have a top 5 class in 2025 and a top 5 class in 2026. And the bottom line is, listen, actually, they have the number 1 class in 2026. Excuse me. I apologize, Auburn fans. You have the right to be mad at me for whiffing on that one. Top 5 class in 2024, top 5 class in 2025, and they got the number 1 class right now in 26. Shout out to my man Freeze there. We got a little bit of a freeze warning down on the plains there, okay? So let's get into it. And I mentioned on Monday's show, I don't talk a ton of football recruiting on this show, simply because if you really look at it, in basketball, right, you can have one player can change the trajectory of an entire program. Football, it's really about stacking not just good players together, but then doing it class after class after class. So you could have a top 5 class in 2021, but if you got a top 30 class in 22, you're not competing 2 or 3 years down the road. Well, what Hugh Freeze is doing, to his credit, I think he's slowly starting to put Auburn in position where maybe a year or two from now, they're going to be in, basically the old John Rothstein saying, they're kind of in position to be in position down the road. First off, mentioned he closed 2024 with a bang. He closed 2023 with a bang, but 2024 first full class, and to his credit, on National Signing Day, that was a top 5 class at the end of signing day. Now, with transfers and stuff, it's now like a top 9, top 10 class. Freeze didn't go heavy in the portal, but that was a class that was stacked. Cam Coleman is a stud, okay? And then Freeze did work right around signing day. Maris Williams, the defensive lineman, flipped from Florida to Auburn. Jamonte Waller flipped from Florida to Auburn. Perry Thompson, the wide receiver, flipped from Bama to Auburn during the summer. So that 2024 class was really good. But let's get to some of what he did over the weekend, because this 2025 class is really coming together, okay? So over the weekend, among the things that Auburn did, here's what you need to know. Derek Smith, 4-star, was committed to Bama, flipped him, now committed to Auburn. Antonio Coleman of the famed Hayes Fawcett graphic, because he once upon a time committed to Alabama, then flipped to Auburn, then flipped back to Bama when Kalen DeBoer took over. Well, he flipped back to Auburn this weekend. 4 commitments, 2 schools. Auburn is in the lead right now. And then on Monday, another big one, Anquan Fagans, 4-star defensive back from Alabama. And so what's interesting is top 5 class in 2024, currently now a top 5 class in 2025. And it's also worth noting 2026, as I said, they got 3 big-time commitments in 2026. And with it, they have the number 1 class in the country in 2026. One other very interesting note, by the way, is that Freeze is largely locking down Alabama. We've talked a lot about Alabama on this show. Number 1 class at one point. Well, with the flips, they're no longer number 1. But what I find very interesting, in this 2025 class, of the top 10 players in the state of Alabama, 7 of them are committed to Auburn. Interestingly enough, and there's another conversation for another day, 2 are committed to Ohio State. 1 is uncommitted but expected to commit this weekend to Auburn. And on top of it, none are committed to Bama. So Freeze is doing work. And listen, if you're an Auburn fan, and our producer Matt, for people who don't know, is in fact an Auburn fan. He's all of a sudden the Auburn gear came back out for this episode after Freeze went on his little recruiting run over the weekend. But why I bring it up is because I just find all of these conversations so interesting as we enter this 12-team playoff era. Because if this was 3, 4, 5 years ago with Freeze, he's got the Freeze, the Freeze on top of the lid there on the graphic. But if this was 3, 4, 5 years ago, I don't know that all of this recruiting makes that much of a difference. You have the rivalry game with Georgia. You have the rivalry game with Bama. And so the road was just so tough to win the SEC and make that 14 college football playoff. But Hugh Freeze is recruiting a roster that if it can stay together, and I know recruiting stuff always kind of changes, and guys flip back, and we'll see what happens as we get closer to signing day, and certainly we'll see what happens in 2026. But what we can't deny is that he is putting together a roster that can compete at the top of the SEC. Maybe not this year, because what Brian Harsin left was a total mess. And maybe next year they're still pretty young. But what did I say? You have to put class upon class upon class to be in the mix. Well, he's doing that. And in the 12-team playoff era, even if the schedule is brutal every year, even if Alabama's on the schedule every year, even if Georgia's on the schedule every year, and by the way, talking about all these changes in college football, I hope those rivalry games stay. I know Auburn fans might want to get out of 1 or 2 of them, but I hope those rivalry games stay. But you don't have to be undefeated. You don't have to sweep Georgia and Bama. You don't have to hope that Kalen DeBoer's a dud and Bama falls apart. All you got to do is be 9-3, 10-2, be in the mix, be the 3rd, 4th best team, and you are going to have a shot in the SEC to make the college football playoff. So I want to get to some basketball, but we got to give credit where it's due, man. Listen, football recruiting, you got to follow the trends. It's not just about one player. It's about, can you stack really good players together in one class and then do it over a 2, 3, 4-year period? Well, we now got one really good class last year. By the way, Freeze again did pretty well in 23, closing out on that one. Really good class in 24, trending as a top 5 class in 25, and 26. We'll see what happens from there.